of hemp makes 20 barrels of oil. No need for pesticides to poison all our soil. People got no food, they got no clothes, they got no rest. Right now, it's time for hemp.
Thank you for taking Time for Hemp. I'm your host, Casper Leitch. You are listening to Time for Hemp on Tumblr, SoundCloud, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and anywhere on the internet that there is sound, we are found. It is Friday, and on Friday, we like to put a spotlight on the hard-working people in small towns around the world, and we're into a small town of Washington, D.C., I believe, with my joint host, Michael Krawitz. Michael, I'm really high. Let me put the car window down. What town are we in?
I think actually we've passed D.C. We're all the way into New York City, aren't we, Hannah?
That's right.
All
wow.
right.
Well, there's so much smoke in the car, it's hard to see. All I see is a 7-Eleven. Let me get a Slurpee while you introduce our audience to our joint guest today here on the big broadcast.
Thanks, Casper. It's great to be here, and as always, thank you for everything you do at Time for Hemp. I'm really, really pleased and honored today to be able to present our guest, Hannah Hetzer. Besides the fact that Drug Policy Alliance is a very important organization to our efforts in the United States to reform cannabis laws, and in fact, on harm reduction and human rights issues, has taken a very central role in the debate around the world, in fact, from this humble little spot, New York City. And a while back, the Drug Policy Alliance picked up, in fact, a international office instead of just having an international kind of union of minds, which was pretty much what Drug Policy Alliance did for many years, bring people together from around the world and work on strategies of drug policy. They actually went the extra mile and set up a policy office, and that's when I first met Hannah. And I just want to, if you could, Hannah, maybe introduce yourself by nature of a little bit of what you were working on that kind of, raised the interest of Drug Policy Alliance in bringing you onto the team.
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and it's good to be on Time for Hemp. So I'm Hannah. I'm the policy manager of the Americas at the Drug Policy Alliance. And as an organization, we focus on broad drug policy reform, and that's everything from marijuana regulation to criminal justice reform to harm reduction and public health interventions. And they brought me on board 4 years ago to manage our international work, because a lot of the focus of the Drug Policy Alliance had been on the U.S., because there's a lot to do here on drug policy reform. But a lot of interesting things had been bubbling up around the world, and especially in Latin America. So my background, before getting into Latin America and those developments, is more from human rights. I was working at different human rights organizations, and the first time I really started thinking about drug policy was when I did my first internship ever at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna at the Latin America and Caribbean unit, who are now the guys we're trying to fight against, actually. And we were doing all of these policies like fumigation and forced eradication of crops, which just seemed really unfair to me at the time, of why are we spraying cultivators in Latin American countries for drugs that go up to the U.S. and Europe. It just didn't seem fair. And then I continued doing work at human rights organizations, usually focused on Latin America. And I was working at Human Rights Watch doing a report on Mexico. And you can't do work on Mexico and not think, God, what are we doing with our drug policies, with the war there, with the almost 100,000 deaths due to drug war violence in the last 7 years, corruption, homicides, just really, really nasty, horrible stuff of this failed drug war. And so then that was my background, and I kind of just met the DPA at the right time when they were thinking more and more internationally, because at that time in 2012, Latin American leaders had really started stepping out and calling for alternatives to the drug war. And you had the presidents of Guatemala and Colombia and Mexico who were saying, this has really affected our nations, and we need to have a new discussion. So DPA thought, well, it's about time to bring someone on to focus on the international work, and that's when they brought me on board.
It seems to me that it's taken a long time for the Americas to kind of get on the same page. I mean, we've all been kind of subject to and somewhat have been the brunt of the worst parts of the drug war, but in very different ways. In the United States, fighting with medicinal access to cannabis for people suffering in the AIDS epidemic, and trying to prevent whole segments of our society from facing a greater likelihood of jail than college. But yet in south of the border, it was mayhem and death. That was what they were facing with border wars and transit country violence that included, what are we up to now? Almost 100,000 deaths.
Yeah, in Mexico in the last 7 years alone.
Yeah, so I think that it's taken us a long time to kind of get on the same page, but I think now, at least from my perspective, and would you agree with that the Americas are starting to speak with more of one voice, saying, we have different reasons for coming to the table, but we're all kind of coming to the table?
Absolutely, that's right. And there's no country in the world that's not affected by the drug war. Everyone's affected by it negatively, but differently. And so, in the 80s and 90s, Europe was really leading the world in terms of drug policy reform with their harm reduction measures and alternatives to incarceration. And the Americas now, it's sort of the decade where the Americas are stronger almost than Europe in these vocal calls. And again, the problem looks different north and south of the border. In Latin America, it's more related to violence, and here it's more related to mass incarceration and unavailable access to medicines. But finally, the Latin American countries, by and large, are uniting and saying enough is enough. We can't have this war anymore. There's still a couple of countries that are holding on to the old repressive approach, but it's the majority that are now looking for alternatives. And so you have this nice situation where this hemisphere is really where most of the reform is happening, both in the United States with marijuana reform and rolling back mass incarceration, and now in Latin America, where you have these presidents talking, you have different organizations talking, and you have a whole slew of marijuana initiatives all over the continent in Latin America.
Yeah, the rank and file cannabis activists in the United States would, I think, quickly mention Uruguay as a hotspot of reform, but have very little idea, I think, of the particulars. And a couple of things strike me right off the bat. For example, that in the United States, marijuana reform has been very much a grassroots effort, eventually affecting the president, but very grudgingly and reluctantly. Whereas, we have national prohibition and not national decriminalization. And we have support of the public. At least finally we have, gaining support of the public. Whereas, as I understood it down in Uruguay, there wasn't broad support of the public, but there was decriminalization. And it wasn't a grassroots effort. It was more a top-down effort. I mean, can you kind of speak to some of that?
Sure. So that's, it's definitely the case that in the States, the public are ahead of the politicians, and the politicians are kind of lagging behind. And in Latin America, the public is still pretty iffy when it comes to drug policy reform, because there's less kind of associations in popular culture around drugs. It's less normalized in some senses. It's more linked to the trade. They can't necessarily separate it as easily from the violence associated with the trade. So in Uruguay, what you had is a country where the use of all drugs and the possession of all drugs had been decriminalized since 1974. That's from marijuana to heroin. People were not going to jail in Uruguay for possession and use of drugs, which is already a completely different scenario than the United States. So they didn't have to make as big a paradigm shift or leap as we had to do here. But you had organizations in Uruguay that were talking about marijuana, and you had years of marijuana marches before the legalization came that got bigger and bigger every year. And those organizations did play a big role. They didn't have the support of the majority of the population, but they were the ones who were talking to legislators. They were the ones who were in marches and talking in the press. And actually in 2010, they worked with legislators to get a home grow domestic cultivation bill in Parliament, which didn't go anywhere. But then it was really up to the fundamental political leadership of President Mujica in Uruguay, who in 2012, he's an old former guerrilla army officer, 78 years old, never smoked marijuana in his life. But in 2012, he came out and said, you know what, regulating marijuana would be a good way of fighting crime and insecurity associated with organized crime around drug production and sale. So that was incredible leadership, and he proposed this, and then quickly members of his party started to get on board, and they wrote a really nice comprehensive bill for regulating marijuana. And then there was a big public campaign where 10 big organizations across Uruguay came together and campaigned, and their campaign was called Responsible Regulation, and it had, human rights organizations, drug policy reform organizations, LGBT, environmental justice, student unions, trade unions. It was really diverse, and they got a list of 100 really notable Uruguayans from the field of science and medicine and pop culture and sports and everything to say we support responsible regulation of marijuana. And then the politicians, felt buoyed by that and felt more comfortable seeing this big campaign, and they eventually voted on it. In December 2013, it became the first country in the world to fully legalize marijuana. So it required big political leadership, but I don't think it also would have been possible without the organizations that accompanied it and did that public campaign.
Viva Uruguay!
Go Uruguay!
I can't say that hard enough or long enough. It strikes me that just kind of as you were talking, I'm sitting here just letting my mind wander, and we had the president of Bolivia that stood up for the coca farmer, and I was actually there at the United Nations when President Morales pulled coca leaves out of his pocket and made a protest at the UN by doing this this outrageously outlaw act of pulling coca leaves out inside the UN. And showing them to everyone and talking about the history and importance to his people of this plant and the culture around it, and for medicine and for food and for products and for their for their lifestyle and their heritage. And to see the President Mujica step forward with his experience and try to fight the cartels, and I guess that's been the main focus. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems to be the main focus of the effort, to break the cartels' hold on the country and not allow them to profit from the use of cannabis, which was decriminalized, but there was no legal source for the cannabis. And here in the United States, it just strikes me that the president is actually a bigger pothead than Casper and I, and that's saying something, that he goes back to days when he had access to cannabis that you can barely dream of today. And that's his experience. And I just, I would love to see him really represent his people, and the president get out there and go to the UN and do what President Morales did. Pull a cannabis bud, a prime bud straight from Colorado out of his pocket, and talk to the UN about this and how important it is to the people of the United States, and how we need this for medicine and for food, and actually you can actually make clothing from it. I don't know that you can do that with the coca leaf. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just maybe lamenting, crying on your shoulder. I don't know if you have comment for that.
Yeah, no, I mean that's our big hope too, that Obama will come to the UN for the General Assembly special session in April and really address the world and talk about the advances that even his administration has made on drug policy. And the last UNGAS in '98, President Clinton addressed the UNGAS, and that was back in the tough on crime days, the drug-free world days. And America's come a long way since that. And Obama and his administration has made big strides for it, at least in the two areas of allowing marijuana reform to move forward on the state level and really trying to implement criminal justice reform. And, it would be great, but I think it's a pipe dream if Obama actually addressed the UN and kind of emitted a public apology for the role that the U.S. had in creating this war and internationalizing this war. I don't think we're going to get that. It would be fantastic. But at the very least, if he came and addressed it and said, this is what we're doing on drug policy reform, and it really made that resounding message to the world, which would be very symbolic. I mean, even the former Attorney General Eric Holder, he's been down to Latin America, and at one point he addressed ministers of security and justice and said, don't make the mistakes we've made with incarceration for drug offenses. Don't go down the route that the U.S. did. And that's a big deal for other countries of the world to hear the U.S. backtracking on something it's fought for so long would be a really big step forward. So hopefully Obama will address the oil and gas, fingers crossed.
You know, and I think that, to be fair and somewhat objective, given all the information that we know, the United States really does owe the world an apology, and not just for recent activities, but for this 1961 convention. You know, we in the marijuana movement are very quick to point out Harry Anslinger as not the friend of the American people in his bureaucratic work in the Department of Narcotics back in the day, the Federal Narcotics Bureau. Of course, the UNGAS that you're talking about is the International Drug Summit, which is coming up very quickly here in April. And, the influence of Anslinger is much deeper than I even thought. We've been working at the World Health Organization recently on scheduling, and the World Health Organization is, of course, the premier evidence-based reviewing source for this information that we have so much of out in the field on cannabis. We're very hopeful that once this evidence actually is processed, that there will be a recommendation and a change in scheduling. So we're working there, and believe it or not, even at the World Health Organization, Harry Anslinger's effect is felt. And the last evidentiary process by which the cannabis is actually scheduled in the international treaty is from 1935, and the head of the evidence gathering process was a Dr. Wolf, who, according to the Transnational Institute, in their great document, The Rise and Fall of Cannabis Prohibition, is attributed with being a USA protege. And of course, in 1935, to be anti-marijuana and a USA protege, stinks of Harry Anslinger. So we do owe the world an apology for our impact on this, especially given the racism and everything that is so much the trademark of the Anslinger administration with regard to marijuana.
We do, and actually, I'm gonna make a pitch actually for anyone who wants to know a little bit more about the history of Anslinger's involvement in a book that reads like a novel. It's absolutely fascinating. I suggest reading Johann Hari's Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. It's a brilliant book, and it reads beautifully. It really is. It reads like a novel. And the first part goes into Anslinger and his history and his involvement in a way that really undercovers the insidious role he had. So that's a pitch for a book that really moved me and really alerted me as well to this very specific and nefarious effect he has had on global drug prohibition.
Well, one thing I know, we have to have an effect on our budget, and in order for that to happen, we got to take a commercial break. And we're going to do that right now and pay our bills. And then we're going to listen to a song about how fantastic cannabis is. And then we're going to come back and pick up where we left off here at Time for Hemp. You are listening to the Time for Hemp Global Broadcasting Network. Please share us with your friends.
Serious Seeds is your source for quality cannabis and sativa seeds. Serious Seeds are the creators of legendary strains like AK-47, Bubblegum, Chronic, Cali Mist, and White Russian. The AK-47 is probably the most awarded strain on the planet. The high THC content of AK-47 makes it the perfect medical strain for patients seeking quick pain relief. Cali Mist is an almost pure sativa. Female medical cannabis patients have reported that this strain helps relieve menstrual cramps. Serious Seeds just acquired another Dutch high-quality seed bank, Magus Genetics. From now on, Serious Seeds can offer you even more award-winning strains. The fine folks at Serious Seeds strive to breed the best cannabis genetics that they can find, so patients can rely on the effectiveness of their medicine. Go to SeriousSeeds.com to grow your medicine. That site again is SeriousSeeds.com.
I got just the thing to make you smile. Marijuana. I'll turn that frown upside down and make you happy. Take my hand now, I'll take you somewhere and play, baby. Marijuana. Go kick off your shoes, let's go dancing in the rain. Ay, 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 marijuana, mira la luna bonita. I'm walking on the moon. Ay, 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 marijuana, mira la luna bonita. Estoy loco por ti, and all the world looks so pretty. Ay, marijuana, ay, marijuana, ay, marijuana, ay, marijuana. I live and love, you make me laugh. Marijuana. You're the reason I get out of bed en la mañana. Oh, sigo enamorado de tu luz. Ooh, I love the way you chase away my blues. Ay, 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 marijuana, mira la luna bonita. I'm walking on the moon. Ay, 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 marijuana, mira la luna bonita. Estoy loco por ti, and all the world looks so pretty. Ay, marijuana, ay, marijuana, ay, marijuana, ay, marijuana. Ay, 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 marijuana, mira la luna bonita. I'm walking on the moon. Ay, 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 marijuana, mira la luna bonita. Estoy loco por ti, and all the world looks so pretty. Ay, 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 marijuana, mira la luna bonita. I'm walking on the moon.
What a lovely tune here on the big broadcast. Time for Hemp being heard all around the world. It's Friday, Small Town Fridays. And we put a spotlight on the hard-working people who are trying to make a difference in their neck of the woods. We are sharing the broadcast today with my joint host, Michael Krawitz, and Michael works diligently with the veterans who are in need of medical cannabis. Michael, why don't you share your website and your work with our friends?
Absolutely, Casper. Thanks for the plug. Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access is, of course, dedicated to ensuring the doctor-patient relationship can be conducted at the VA without any interference and any risk of and any kind of adverse effect on your benefits, etc. And we're making sure that medical cannabis is accessible. And our frontline issues are adding post-traumatic stress as a qualifying condition in the various states, since we are relying on state medical marijuana laws, and since the VA is a federal entity and at this point isn't allowed to handle it. And we're working with the VA, and we can tell everyone that the VA medical marijuana policy, even though it expired at the end of January, is continuing on. It's not going anywhere. The policy in place won't go away unless it's rescinded, we found out. So a little detail they forgot to mention when we were panicking just before it went away at the end of January. But the Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access can be found on Facebook, is probably the easiest place, facebook.com/usa.vmca, as in Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access. And hope to be working with Congressman Blumenauer out in your neck of the woods out there in Portland, Oregon, on this Veterans Equal Access Amendment that will actually change VA policy, an incremental step towards getting them to be able to handle cannabis. And we'll see how that goes. But for the moment, we're working hard in the states. And back to, I think, Hannah, one of the things that really strikes me as I'm looking at this from a USA cannabis activist perspective, and then kind of looking at the big lay of the land that I've been privy to as a kind of a bit player in this drama of the World Drug Policy Program from the NGO perspective, non-government organization working in New York and in Vienna with the NGO committees. It strikes me that inside the United States, we have this perspective that, of course, what we're doing is legal. Of course, it's supported by our Constitution. Of course, the U.S. Constitution, like all constitutions, are very deeply respected by the international drug control treaties. And of course, since the U.S. federal law is unchanged, and we've just kind of negotiated this settlement on how we handle the states, we consider ourselves to be very much in the clear as to our treaty obligations. Our government officials have joined together with Uruguay and others and are talking about the fact that, hey, if we're going to allow for death penalty to be used for drugs in some cases, which is way outside of the norm of what we want to be the enforcement of the treaty, in so-called flexibility of the treaty's enforcement, then we should certainly allow for cannabis to be legal as a flexibility of our enforcement of the treaty. So, all these kind of perspectives are then colliding with, sorry about that, all those perspectives are colliding with the reality that the United States has actually been the guardian of the treaties. I mean, not only were we responsible for, helping to get them passed with our friend Harry Anslinger, but, we've been the stick and the carrot and stick relationship that countries have had in terms of these drug control treaties, very quick to punish nations that don't behave. So the United States backing out of that is creating all kinds of issues, but the rest of the world is looking at us and is saying, of course you're in violation of the treaty. And the International Narcotics Control Board is saying, well, we never heard of flexibility before. So what's your take on all that, the flexibility and the perspective of our activism here in the Americas from the rest of the world, and the activism in the U.S. from the rest of the Americas?
Yeah, so the U.S. has found itself in quite an uncomfortable situation right now, and is playing a diplomatic game where, the treaties, the UN conventions on drugs, they allow for medical marijuana and they allow for decriminalization, but they do not allow for the regulation/legalization of marijuana production and sale. So Uruguay is in violation of the treaties, and that would mean that the U.S. states, what they're doing would be in violation of the treaties. Now, what the U.S. is saying is that the states are not beholden to the treaties, and the federal government hasn't legalized, so they cannot force the states to do what the federal government does on the states' territories. So, in fact, the U.S. government isn't violating the conventions because it's on the state level, not the national level. That, to me, is, it's a smart argument, but I would say that probably a lot of international lawyers would disagree with that. I think it's a good thing, because essentially when the Obama administration gave the green/yellow light to the states to move forward with its marijuana policies, they then had to extend that same green light to other countries experimenting. And it has been good because it meant that the U.S. can no longer be as aggressive internationally in terms of enforcing the treaties and enforcing them on the other countries that want to legalize. So that opens space for places like Uruguay, Canada, other countries that are looking to legalize. It opens up a space because if the U.S. were to turn around and say, you're in violation of the treaties, they could easily turn around and point the finger at the U.S. states, and that would leave the U.S. in a very uncomfortable position. So it's actually working out pretty well for us. It's meant that the U.S. has been less aggressive aggressive on this. And as long as the states continue to legalize, that would probably have to be the case, or else the U.S. would just be called out for huge hypocrisy. But the flexibility argument, I mean, the fact that what Uruguay is arguing is that they're doing this marijuana regulation because it's for the health and safety of mankind, which is the basic proposition of the drug control conventions, and human rights and health trump drug control. The U.S. is arguing for flexibility. I mean, the problem is if you take a very strict reading of the conventions, it's not flexible with regards to regulation of sales. So for right now, I think we can go along with the flexibility argument and hope that other countries legalize. But I think the more countries that start to legalize, the more impetus there will be for actual real treaty reform that reflects these changes and actually allows for regulation of sale and production. Because otherwise, it's just like it's turning a blind eye. And it might be similar to what happens on the U.S. level, where a lot of social changes happen on the state level first, and it happens with a minority of states, and then it grows, and then at some point the U.S. government has to respond. And that was the case with same-sex marriage. It's been the case with a lot of other things. I'm hoping that something similar will happen with the UN conventions, where enough countries will start to legalize that at some point the UN cannot ignore it anymore, and then we have actual treaty revision.
I've been privy, as I said before, to a lot of inside stuff that the rank and file marijuana movement, the cannabis movement out there really doesn't have access to. And in fact, a little plug for Time for Hemp, we've done about a dozen shows now with a full-on international series that had people in different continents on at the same time on a live show. It was very ambitious, and all that's in the archives. And I encourage folks that are interested in learning more about the entire process of the drug control program at the United Nations, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and all these terms that we throw around all the time. We go into great length in describing what all that means and how it all connects. And in fact, we talked quite a bit over the last couple of years about this drug summit coming up this coming April. And, it strikes me that the mainstream news just misses, 80% of what we cover. I mean, and the other 20% of what we cover in a way that's, directly from the people involved, in a way that the news doesn't have the time to cover. One thing I'll say right now that you would never probably ever hear in the mainstream news is connected to cannabis, at the state level, is the impact of what the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement branch does at the State Department. But in fact, the head of the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement branch is the guy, as I understand it, that'll be presenting that flexibility argument to the United Nations as we come into this Commission on Narcotic Drugs meeting in Vienna. Is that pretty correct?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, what do you think that the fact that these processes are, well, let me rephrase the question right from the beginning. Back in the day when I was just starting to work on this, it was really vexing because working in the United States, there's a real tension where people on the street they don't like the international bodies, the UN. They don't want to talk about treaties. They don't think treaties are relevant in the United States because the United States federal government has given them the impression over time that the United States is either above treaties or just doesn't really care about treaties. And that's unfortunate because they're part of our U.S. constitutional law. According to our U.S. Constitution, treaties that are ratified have the weight of federal law. So they're not going away. And in fact, when you want to legalize marijuana at the national level, or in fact change any of the policy to regulate non-medical access to these drugs, you're going to run headlong into the treaty, as you said before. We've signed into these commitments, and they're not going away. So I wonder, from your perspective, do you think the lack of engagement of our cannabis movement in the United States with these International Narcotics and Law Enforcement branch, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, I mean the so-called drug czar's office, I mean they don't even really have any direct contact that I know of with the marijuana movement, other than watching it on TV like everyone else. They don't take advantage of the back channels that are open to communicate with the movement. And they're very much in the dark as to what's really going on out there. It's unfortunate because it goes both ways. inside these processes over in Vienna, I've seen the Community Anti-Drug Coalitions of America, so-called CADCA, really dominate these discussions with our Office of National Drug Control Policy and work behind the scenes, gaining millions and millions and millions, if not into the billions of dollars in grant money that's given to quote-unquote prevention, which may be very good in some cases, but in the case of marijuana, amounts to a handful of people dispensing misinformation. So, I mean, what do you think? Do you think we lack the engagement? Are we ignoring it rightfully? Where do you come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a shame that often the U.S. public might not involve themselves as much with policies or developments that are happening outside of the U.S. because, again, this is a global war and it's a U.S. created war. So if there's any feeling of sort of responsibility, I think it's important for people to understand that the war that the U.S. created that's affecting so many Americans is affecting so many global citizens, and to be cognizant of that. It should be of interest, and this is an interlinked international thing. The only way we'll get real reform across the world is if the world moves forward together. And the United Nations, it's sometimes it's a bureaucratic, frustrating mess, but it is important because although the treaties are not going to be enforced in any way where countries will pay real consequences, they serve as a big obstacle to reform. And so, it would be great if we said, let's have all the countries ignore some part of the treaties and go ahead with their marijuana regulation or other reforms. And that's what Uruguay is doing. But Uruguay is a small country. It's not something that I think Canada will do. I don't think it's something that the U.S. will do. International law does matter. And the problem that we find ourselves with the UN treaties is we're at a kind of crossroads where we find ourselves in the reform community almost wishing that some countries will ignore the treaties and regulate marijuana. But that's not necessarily a great thing to promote, the ignoring of international law, because there's important other things in international law, like human rights frameworks and health frameworks. So we need to uphold, international rule of law, but this one just isn't working, so we need to change it. And in the meantime, it might just work best if countries change their own national policies, and it does have to respond. But essentially, Americans should take note because unless things change at the UN level, there won't be massive, wide-scale U.S. change because the U.S., again, it created a lot of these frameworks. So if anything, it would just be embarrassing if on a federal level it completely ignored them. And I think the U.S. is too caught up in some parts of diplomacy to ever do that. So everyone should take note across the world on this, and Americans as well. It does affect the U.S.
Well, I got a question here. Casper. One thing I don't understand is we have a hemp industry from around the world. China, Canada, Australia, many countries grow and import into this country hemp items. We have in the United States cannabis legal and patchworks, state here, state there, not a state here, not a state there, their state, not a state. We can't figure out what state we're in. And so it looks like we're on the verge of having some kind of, I don't know, everybody on one sheet of music. Am I missing it here? I can't figure it. Like in Australia, you can sell hemp seed, but you can't consume. You have to write on there, not for consumption. And I mean, there's a lot of stupid laws, too, about it. But so what is going on? Why is it that some countries like China and Canada and Australia have a huge, thriving hemp industry? Even Canada will help subsidize the advertising sometimes of the hemp industry for their cosmetics and cloth, etc. But we can't even do that here in our own country.
Yeah, well, hemp is the perfect example of drug war hysteria going so far that it overrides any scientific or logical bases. Because hemp is it's not a drug. It's not a psychoactive substance. It's the fears that a lot of people have around drug consumption. That's just not the case with something that would be industrialized for uses that have nothing to do with psychoactive properties. So I think a lot of other countries are just a lot more realistic about it because it's not banned in the conventions. I mean, hemp, industrial hemp isn't illegal or prohibited under the conventions. So I think a lot of other countries are just a lot more sane about it and recognize that it's not a drug, that it's an industrial product, and therefore they'll regulate it and have different relationships with it to varying degrees. But in the U.S., it's still so much associated with drug war hysteria and myths and fears around any kind of drugs and any kind of relationships to substances that they've gone so far as condemning something that's completely unpsychoactive. So until you get a real change in mentality from some people in office in the United States, you will have these patchwork reforms because there's still people who hold political power that have these completely nonsensical ideas of what hemp actually is.
And speaking of real change, that's what we need to collect from our sponsors, and we can't collect change from our sponsors unless you go and let them know that you heard about them here on Time for Hemp.
You are listening to the Time for Hemp Global Broadcasting Network. The only broadcasting network dedicated to ending the global war on drugs on iHeartRadio.
Are the premier physicians clinic in the United States. THCF has offices all across the United States from Hawaii to Michigan. THCF Medical Clinics has helped approximately 150,000 patients obtain their medical marijuana permits to legally possess, grow, and use medical marijuana. If you have chronic pain, multiple sclerosis, or any other neurological degenerative disease, or if you have any gastrointestinal disorders such as GERD, irritable bowel syndrome, or if you have AIDS, cancer, spastic disorders, seizure disorders, or glaucoma, call us at 1-800-723-0188 or visit us online at hemp.org. Again, the number is 1-800-723-0188 and the site is hemp.org.
Yeah, stay alert with consciousness and let the world know around you how important it is to end prohibition. Please get involved in doing something besides sitting there and trying to figure out if Niles and Frazier are going to have a date this weekend. Put one foot in front of the other and get out that door and make the world a better place. Also, if you are hanging out around the house, you don't have much to do, make it a point to go to timeforhemp.com and check out our live streaming growing marijuana. We got marijuana growing from gardens here in Portland, Oregon. They're legal gardens. And we got high-definition cameras 24 hours a day. You can check it out. Wolf Siegel is the gardener of the gardens, and he will be doing tutorials and checking out different ways to make his garden better, to share tips with you in his blog. So we're going to be doing this for a couple years. We're going from small tents now to all the way up to a large greenhouse at the end of a 2-year period. So any type of gardening that has to do with cannabis, whether it be in your closet, in your basement, in your room, in your backyard, in your greenhouse, or in your 40-acre farm, we're going to have a camera and a farmer show you how to do it best here on Time for Hemp. Michael?
Thanks, Casper. That's really exciting stuff. You know, it was a huge fight to get a show garden over in the Cannabis College in the Netherlands years ago. And, you know, you doing this is really, you're kind of taking on the baton, and I think it's really cool. I wanted to really thank you, Hannah Hetzer, our guest today for the America's Office of Drug Policy Alliance. You've really done a stellar job behind the scenes. You know, our listeners know a lot about NGOs. They know that the United Nations itself is a country club, as I call it, and the non-governmental organizations are guests. And to organize and make ourselves heard collectively, we do form these NGO committees. And at one point, it was a very difficult time for the New York NGO Committee coming back from the dead, you know, from the ashes. And you played a very pivotal role as a member of a committee to nominate the first board, and as such, we're excluded from being able to be a board member for the first round, and a sacrifice for the board and for you that maybe you don't even think about or talk about, but I want to talk about it because we really, really thank you for your efforts. And now, of course, we've created the Civil Society Task Force. You can listen to our previous show with Donald McPherson, and he can talk about the Civil Society Task Force, and it's helping us communicate with the UN. And I'm wondering, you know, what's your take on the NGO committee, and just, you know, go right from there if you want to just kind of shoot into what Drug Policy Alliance has for us for UNGAS.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And I also, you know, have to say to anyone listening, like, congratulations to you and the huge role you have played for years on the international stage, really linking U.S. reforms with the international. You know, last time, right before the break, speaking about Americans engaging in international policy, you've been incredible for years. So thank you for all your work. So we, the civil society, the New York NGO Committee, that process has been interesting because the Vienna NGO Committee has been around for a long time, and that one is, you know, populated by more conservative organizations by and large, historically, sort of the drug-free organizations. And there's been a board change on that recently, but the New York NGO Committee was restarted again with the hope that with UNGAS coming to New York City, it can play a pivotal role and also bring to the table organizations that are a lot more reform-minded. And it's, of course, open to everyone, so there is a diverse membership, and it's not closed or exclusive, but it has just so happened that the organizations that have, by and large, joined New York NGO Committee are more progressive, and so that's been fantastic. And the startup and the work around that and what they've managed to achieve in terms of attaining legitimacy with the UN for it being a body has been fantastic. And the creation of the Civil Society Task Force, which is interviewing people all over the world to get answers to provide to the UN on drug policy reform. It's been such a pivotal place for civil society organizations to have input to something that's often very complicated. Again, the UN makes itself probably purposely very complex and difficult to navigate. But those bodies have really helped a lot of organizations navigate those inner corridors. With the DPA, what we're doing for UNGAS, you know, this is a big question, and UNGAS, a lot of the organizing around UNGAS falls into kind of two camps, the inside strategy versus the outside strategy. And with the inside game, it's, you know, lobbying governments and missions and UN agencies and the UN system itself to be more progressive on drug policy. So trying to influence outcome documents and member states' positions at UNGAS and other UN agencies to weigh in on the debate. So it's not just the conservative UN Office on Drugs and Crime. That has to do with the whole inside strategy, and there's a number of really fantastic allies around the world working on that. So we've been involved in that. And then with the outside game, that's the whole idea of how are we going to bring what's happening in the UN to the public, to those who are not going to be inside the UN, to the media, to the U.S. Public, to public around the world. And there's a really exciting group of campaigns and organizations that are going to be in New York and campaigning up to the UNGAS to make our voices heard, to say, this war has affected millions around the world, and we need to make sure our voices and our demands are heard. And so we're working on various public activities around the UNGAS. It's going to be an exciting week in New York for anyone who can make it down that week. The official UNGAS is from the 19th to the 21st, but there will be a huge day of public action on the 18th where there's going to be a protest in New York at Foley Square, then a protest in front of the UN, then a day of art exhibits from students in a park in New York, and a nighttime service in a church in New York. And the campaigns that are coming together are the caravan from Latin America that's bringing people who have lost their loved ones to the war on drugs. And they're going to meet up with Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Hundreds of students are going to be there. They're going to meet up with the Families campaign, which brings families from around the world that have lost loved ones. Faith leaders are going to join the call. Drug policy reformers are going to join the call. So it'll be a beautiful day of multiple voices coming together and protesting in front of the UN and saying, this is what we want. So we've been working on that. And then, of course, we'll be at the UN from the 19th to the 21st and just really hope that the conversation there is transparent and that they will really allow civil society to give input.
The process seems to be clearly aimed at some distant point, that those who really had any hope of 2016 really delivering some sort of reform have kind of given up on that, I think, at this point, and are looking at 2019. And a lot of countries I've heard are looking at the notion of having some sort of commission or delegation of nations to look into this flexibility and stuff like that. I mean, does that sound like the lay of the land to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're definitely tempering our hopes for UNGAS. We're not going to get big-scale treaty revision at this UNGAS. The most we can hope for is that it's a little bit more transparent and that some of the outcome documents say good things. But the next big milestone is going to be 2019. And if UNGAS turns out to be, a total failure, then our strategy is going to switch to, right after the UNGAS, really just publicly shaming the UN on their inability to really do a proper analysis and an open debate on something that, that had been the reason for the UNGAS. When the three ex-presidents of Mexico, Colombia, and Guatemala got together and called for the UNGAS at the UN, it was with the idea that we need to have an honest conversation about drug policy because it's not working. And if the UN can't even manage to have an open debate on that, that's something I think we are going to tell the world and really publicly shame them. So hopefully that will give some impetus to 2019 working a bit better.
Well, it is time to put a spotlight on all the amazing URLs that you want to drive traffic to and make people aware of an organization or two they might want to get involved with. Hannah? If you're interested in, organizing around UNGAS, I would definitely check out the Stop the Harm campaign website. I think it's just stoptheharm.org. stoptheharm.org. That's where you can find kind of the central campaigns around UNGAS organizing. There's also, if anyone wants to read an article about the different campaigns underway, I recently wrote one for the Huffington Post that I will have to send the URL to you for, but it's about the different campaigns coming together for UNGAS. And Michael?
Well, thanks again, Casper. It's really a privilege and an honor to stand at your side on Fridays, Small Town Fridays, coming into New York City this week. And I thank you, Hannah. This is really, really great work that you're doing. Drug Policy Alliance, as always, is our coach as we're out in the field working on drug policy reform. Maybe a good analogy just came up with. We'll see how it floats. But thanks, everybody. And Much love, and I'll see you next week.
And I want to remind people that we are no longer just a 1-hour broadcast. As a matter of fact, for a couple of years now, we've been a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, all cannabis, all broadcasting network, the only one in iHeartRadio. And we appreciate it when you let your friends know about what we do here. You can find all the past programs in our archives. Anyone who's done a show here on the network, their biography and their archive pages are located here, so you can share their content freely with your friends. Lots of apps that you can download us through. You can use us from Tumblr, SoundCloud, iHeart, and lots of other groovy ways to get this information into the hands of your friends around you. And like a good joint, we're always best when you do share us with your friends. And it is important for the whole world to know how important it is to take time for hemp.
Look at all that money, yeah, the money.
You are listening to the Time for Hemp Global Broadcasting Network. The only broadcasting network dedicated to ending the global war on drugs on iHeartRadio.